Well, thank you, everybody, for inviting me to come talk. Again, everybody understand me? Got me in the center frame, Judy?
I think we're good.
Okay. Well, I was actually here a couple of months ago helping my father who presented back in November, I think, on his book, and got to meet Judy again, and she was nice enough to invite me here. And so when she invited me to the Bighorn Community Center and about my book, which is here and has 35 stories, little vignettes of history, I was certain, because there's a couple or two or three of them that are Bighorn related, and I expected her to tell me that that's the one I should be giving a program to. And to my surprise, she asked me for a subject that is very hot around Broadus, Montana, where a lot of my articles are printed in the newspaper there. And it turned out that this is the reason why there are so many Garbers here today. Obviously, the Garbers are pioneering family here in Bighorn and well known. And I've been in contact with Vic, who's here today, about this incident that, like I said, is a hot topic in Broadus, but I was very surprised to find out it was of such interest here. But I'm happy to talk about it. This subject is the subject of 4 chapters in my book. It's that big a topic in Broadus. So that's what goes for big topics in Broadus, if you're curious. So the subject of the talk is murder in Montana, Ray Tarbell versus George Mitchell. So the question of the range is what the Sheridan Press said this was about whenever Ray Tarbell killed George Mitchell. And what do they mean by the question of the range? The question of the range is that whose range is it, and who gets to determine what happens on it. And largely in this area, it also meant the conflict between sheep and cattle. So to put some context into this, in December of 1900, we have the Bear Creek sheep raid, which my father wrote a book on, and I wrote a small article about. And that's where John B. Kendrick and George Brewster killed 2,000 head of sheep on Bear Creek and got away with it. And then in 1901, and by the way, Bear Creek is in Powder River County, just across the border from Rosebud. And then in 1901, Hank Greenway, who was running some sheep for some people, got what they called a white cap notice. Says, if you take sheep to Powder River, bring your coffin along, you will need it. And then, of course, over in Ten Sleep, in April of 1909, is when the Spring Creek sheep raid occurred, where 3 people were killed. And that finally broke the back of the public's willingness to tolerate violence in the name of cattle and sheep, to a large extent. But the question of range meant specifically that no small livestock operations could depend on the legal system in northern Wyoming and eastern Montana. And this is a description of one of those incidents. George Mitchell, this is the man himself, was a longtime cattleman, former wagon boss for the Yen Bar. He was the father of 8 children, and when he was killed, his wife was pregnant with twins, not counting the 8. He had a strong dislike of sheep. Now then, remember when I talked about Kendrick and the Bear Creek sheep raid? That was about the sheep operations of Robert R. Selway. And this all occurred around Sonnet, if you know what we're talking about. Well, George Mitchell had an understanding with Robert Selway about where his range began and ended, and where Selway's did. But after about 1900 or 1901 or 2, Selway came to Sheridan, and his operations were being run by his brother. And we'll discuss this, but my speculation is because Selway wasn't there, this is what caused the hard feeling to start. And by the way, George Mitchell was known as, quote, somewhat peppery and set in his ways. So, I don't know how many of you that describes, but it certainly described George Mitchell. Roy Tarbell, on the other hand, and you notice I have Roy Tarbell with 2 L's and then over here with B-E-L. That's because he went by both names. He was born with this name, and he changed it when we moved from Nebraska to Montana to this name. He was born in New York. His family moved to Nebraska when he was young. He came to Montana in 1891 and came here rather permanently in 1902. He was a cattleman. He was in partnership with a rancher around Broadus, a pioneer rancher named Link Wilson. We'll get to him in a second. And they formed the UA Ranch around in what was then Powder River County, or Custer County. It's now Powder River County, but it was Custer County at the time. Roy Tarbell had a troubled history in Nebraska. He was married and divorced, and he also, as what came out later in the trial for this incident, he killed a man in Bridgeport, Nebraska. Self-defense, as we will see in a little bit. And later, he partnered with this man, Leo Orschel, on a cattle ranch on the Bacon Powder River near where Biddle is right now. Justice Lincoln Wilson, also known primarily by the name Link Wilson, was a pioneer sheepman of eastern Montana. He was an initial partner of Robert R. Selway, Arthur Clark on the old S.H. Sheep Company on the Tongue River. And in about 1906, he expanded from just sheep to sheep and cattle with Ray Tarbell and the UA Ranch. So he was also one of the first people to have a car in eastern Montana and that sort of thing. He was very rich and very influential. On September 8, 1909, there was a sanctioned fall roundup that occurred near what present-day Sonnet. It was actually called Selway around that time, but there was a sanctioned roundup that occurred. And where this occurred, it was being run by the UA Ranch, Tarbell and Wilson's. Okay. Usually I say the undisputed facts. There's only one undisputed fact here. And that is that George Mitchell was shot dead by Ray Tarbell. And that's the only fact that is undisputed in this whole thing. So we'll get to this. So what happened was, at this roundup, George Mitchell, his son Ray Mitchell, and his employee Henry Jackson came to this sanctioned roundup that was neighbored his own ranch, presumably for the purpose of collecting his own cattle. Seems like a reasonable thing to do. And while he was there, another group of cowboys bringing in coming in off circle, brought some cows into the roundup, and this group included Ray Tarbell, a man named John Woodley, Billy Eubanks, and several others, but those were the three. That mean, as soon as they saw George Mitchell, they loped around and confronted him. There was an initial, we'll get to the dispute there, but there was an initial fight between Mitchell and Woodley, and then the shooting began. The shooting then became general, and George Mitchell, by the way, was not armed. His son Ray and Henry Jackson were armed. Okay, Tarbell was armed, Woodley was armed, Eubank was armed, and they all started shooting. And it's a matter of I don't know if you want to talk about aim or the quality of the guns, But there was at least 20 shots fired among these 5 people, at least. Okay? And the only thing that hit was one of them might have hit the leg of one of the horses. That was it. So, and that hitting the horses, it was Jackson's horse who threw him off. And he started shooting from the ground, and then there was a pause to reload. And then George Mitchell goes up to Henry Jackson, grabs his gun, gets back on his horse, and supposedly turns his back to leave. And that's when Roy Tarbell comes up behind him. They have a conversation. I'll get a little bit into this as well. They get in conversation, and what actually is quite a rare instance where 2 cowboys, face to face, have guns drawn, and it's not a quick draw, but they're sitting there pointing at each other, waiting for one to go. And it happened, and George Mitchell fell over dead, shot through the aorta. His body was taken back to his ranch, and Ray Tarbell went back turned himself in to the Custer County Sheriff. Link Wilson, his partner, bailed him out, and this begun the preliminary hearing. So, a preliminary hearing, the purpose of it is to determine if there's sufficient evidence to bring whatever the crime alleged is to trial. So, in this case, the defense attorney for Ray Tarbell was this man, Charles Loud. Charles Loud is a former judge, known for the Geddes cases, if you've read my book, or the Little Whirlwind cases. And his defense was financed by Link Wilson. The prosecution was this man, Sharpless Walker. That's a heck of a name, Sharpless. I don't know. The preliminary hearing was done under Justice Gibb in Miles City. And again, the purpose, this is key, the purpose of it is there sufficient evidence to bring a trial? So, in a preliminary hearing, the defense, if they can't make a home run and basically demonstrate that the prosecution has no case at all, okay, they are not incentivized to bring their evidence. So, have you ever heard you can prosecute a ham sandwich? That's what this means. So, most of what happened at the preliminary hearing was that the prosecution brought forward several witnesses to describe what they saw on that day in 1909. So, a couple of details were emerged. One was that the Tarbell faction initiated the hostility. This was what the prosecution was saying. Included in this was that Scott Mitchell was not allowed to cut his uncle's cattle. So Scott Mitchell was the nephew of George Mitchell. Okay. Tarbell and company aggressively approached Mitchell the moment they are seen. When they get there, Woodley attempted to strike Mitchell. They had words. Woodley attempts to strike Mitchell with his gun. Doesn't shoot him, hit him, misses completely, and then Jackson intervenes in between them, and the shooting starts. Okay. Now, why did this occur? What was the animosity? The animosity had to do with Link Wilson, a sheep man, I believe, encroaching on what George Mitchell thought was his range. And George Mitchell did not like this, and may or may not have made threats. We'll get into that. Okay? But this is a question of the range problem. Mitchell tried to leave and was called back by Tarbell. Mitchell was shot before he could fire, according to the prosecution, and then as his father lay instantly dead on the ground, Roy Tarbell threatened Ray Mitchell, George's son, as well, right then and there. As I said, Ray Tarbell confronted him and he turned it back by saying, "Hold on, I don't want to have to shoot you in the back." That's what the prosecution says. So, as you can probably tell, they did not put Ray Tarbell on the stand. They did not put a single defense witness on the stand. They just got the prosecution's witnesses on the record because Charles Loud knew this was going to trial. And they knew that, and so from a defense legal strategy, it's very good, and it actually worked. And so they got them on trial. Then, in December, so we're talking 3 or 4 months later, begins the first trial of Ray Tarbell. And this is Ray Tarbell right here on the horse. And the trial occurred in Miles City. And then begins the trial of the irreconcilable narratives. There are some things where you can go in the middle. You can see on both sides. In this case, either if you were prosecution or the defense, both presented a set of facts that are almost on every level mutually exclusive. If one person said something, if the defense said something, the prosecutor said the exact opposite on almost everything. So, prosecution says the violence initiated by the Tarbell faction with Woodley attempting to strike Mitchell with a pistol. The defense said the violence was initiated by the Mitchell faction when Mitchell attempted to strike Woodley with a quirt. Okay. The prosecution said the shooting was initiated by Ray Tarbell. The defense said Henry Jackson started this. And by the way, there are multiple witnesses to each side of this. Because this was a roundup, there were cowboys all around it. Okay, the prosecution says that Tarbell called Mitchell to prevent him from leaving, and this was the infamous, "I don't want to shoot you in the back." The defense says Mitchell just stops leaving the roundup without any external prompting and turns around. Mitchell does not get off a shot. You can ask the defense. Mitchell shot first, followed quickly by Tarbell. Ray Mitchell, who had a gun, and it was the only one in the place that was an automatic, which sounds different than everybody else's pistol. He says he does not fire his weapon. He draws it, but he doesn't fire it. The defense witnesses, more than one, say they heard Ray Mitchell's automatic pistol firing. Eyewitness testimony. So, therefore, what do the witnesses say? We've got Ray Mitchell, that's this man in the center. That's the man who was beside his father when he was shot. He was the primary witness. Lehman Wilkes was another witness that wasn't a defendant. And then Scott Mitchell as well. Henry Jackson was obviously, and by the way, the law went after Henry Jackson, Tarbell, Eubanks, and Woodley. So they all got charged anyway. The reason this whole group over here is here is this man, Roy Garber. There's the gardener that's also involved. Actually, with this group, there is a Ray Tarbell, a Ray Mitchell, a Ray Wilson, and a Roy Garber. And then there's a guy named Gardner as well. So anyway, Roy Garber, Bummy Schubert, Ray Wilson, and Beecher Warner were among the several, not just witnesses, eyewitnesses to the actual incident itself, along with Eubanks, Tarbell, and Woodley. And so, when this all comes together, these are the people who are testifying to this and to this. So what this demonstrates is the factionalism that was occurring around Powder River at this time. The sheep cattle, factions. You rode with your brand, and the truth followed that. Okay? The verdict, and this is Roy Garber right here. The first trial was a hung jury, and with only one juror voting to convict. Trial number 2 was that Roy Tarbell was deemed not guilty, and this occurred with a great deal of hard feelings. It's hard to describe. Like I said, even today, this incident gathers emotion. Like I said, if you want to have your side of the story go deep into history, have 10 kids, and let them stay in the area for years and years, and have them have several kids, and pretty soon, there are a bunch of Mitchells around, and they all swear up and down that George Mitchell was murdered by Ray Tarbell. That Link Wilson specifically hired Ray Tarbell to kill George Mitchell. That's what several of them allege. And by the way, the wife not only had 10 kids by George Mitchell, then the widow married another man and had 2 more kids with him. Now then, one of the interesting things that Vic told me about Roy Garber is that, and this is what I'm talking about the ill feeling. He was placed as a witness in protective custody in the Custer County Jail, and he was there so long in that protective custody because there were threats, and he learned to play checkers so well, and that's where he learned it, because he was spending his days and nights in the Custer County Jail for his own protection. Protection from who? That was an interesting story. I talked to several of the Mitchells, and it sounded like the one person that the Tarbells and Woodley were scared about was Mitchell's wife, who was discovered in Miles City during a trial and had her shotgun taken away from her. Now then, Ray Tarbell had his own friends, and they of course wanted him free, and that occurred. But he never spoke about it again, that I could tell. And the judge at the time, who eventually became the justice of the Montana Supreme Court, his name was Sidney Sanner. He again discussed this whole notion of factionalism. And he says the time was when men got into controversies and lost their temper, they were content with the weapons nature gave them. But it seems in these times, and in that particular locality, it is the customary to carry firearms and sometimes to use them without any conception of what the consequences may be. I suggest to those factions in Powder River that it's an excellent time to eliminate this indiscriminate firearm business and try to do well with this rashness and ill feeling. This is a picture of George Mitchell's ranch. This is George Mitchell, and this was Eva, and this is a couple of the kids, 3 or 4 of the kids in there. What this tragedy shows, it shows the weakness of Custer County's criminal justice system at the time. The Miles City Independent, after the second trial, and Ray Tarbell was acquitted, he said, quote, "There is not a Miles City man on the jury, contrary to the general belief which was asserted that Miles City people have turned loose every man from the county charged with a crime." So, Ray Tarbell did not have any children. after this incident, he did get remarried, and I believe at that time, with his marriage, he turned a new leaf. He didn't discuss either one of his killings, but he did, and he was a respected cattleman. So at one point, he moves to Sheridan, and he, like I said, he was very respectful, but he was also very grateful, not grateful, but he used his reputation as a dangerous man to his advantage. He would intimidate, he didn't have to do anything, people just knew who he was, and with the Mitchells going around there telling everybody he was a cold-blooded killer, he didn't need to do much. But like I said, he moved out on the baking powder, where he married, but they did not have any children. But they did help raise his wife's niece, and she spoke glowingly of Ray Tarbell, and everybody who are during this period who knows Ray Tarbell spoke very well of him. So there you go. And so if in several chapters of the book that I've got, I outline places where Custer County in Montana's criminal justice system just collapses. And it is of no use to a small-time livestock operator. And in this case, that's exactly what George Mitchell was. He wasn't Robert Arcelway. He wasn't Link Wilson. He wasn't John B. Kendrick. He wasn't George Geddes, or any of the other things that happened in Custer County. And for that, but what he was quarrelsome, stubborn, and didn't like sheep. And in this case, this is one of the fewer aspects where the sheep man did the violence and the sheep man won, in this case. So, there's all kinds of little aspects to this story. Like I said, it represents 4 chapters in my book. That's over here, Big Skies and Bygone Days, along with other aspects. And they're available for sale in your local bookstop or right over here. So if you have any questions about this, I encourage you to read those 4 chapters and give me any questions you might have. All right? Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Did I see somewhere that Kendrick was indicted for the Spring Creek raid over by Tinsley? He was one of the people on the indictment list.
Okay. The question is Mike's question is, was John B. Kendrick in any way indicted for the Spring Creek raid over in Tinsley? That answer is no. Actually, at the time that happened, no, he wasn't. What the relationship between Spring Creek and John B. Kendrick is that one of the raiders who was arrested, several of them were arrested. A couple of them actually started serving time, and then there was a bunch of people who started writing the governor trying to get him commuted. And so the guy who was the last one of them was commuted by the governor. This is the Spring Creek raid, where 3 people were killed, and the governor who commuted that sentence was John B. Kendrick, who was a sheep raider himself. Only he was better at it, and no one was killed.
Well,
So
thank
that,
you
yes.
for clearing that up.
Okay. Any other questions?
Shane, just to kind of clarify, When the sheep and cattle thing on Pumpkin Creek came about, we were talking about public land, right? Not homestead land.
Right, yeah, this was all, like I said, this is the question of range, and by which I mean open range. So in most of these cases, large swaths of this area, as you know, were federal land, and then if you could go through the procedures for a homestead claim, you could get a limited amount of acreage. But a lot of times that was limited to watering holes and control of the range. But the range itself was usually open range federal land. But they claimed it nonetheless. And so Mitchell claimed his land, and Selway claimed his land, and Wilson claimed his land, and then and especially, like I said, there was a problem with sheep and cattle. What cattlemen objected to sheep for were several things. One, sheep have two sets of teeth, and they bite grass shorter to the ground. And so the cattlemen said that the cattle only have one set of teeth, and they just pull it. And so the thinking of the cattlemen is that sheep in your area damaged the grazing land, the pasture. Another thing is that sheep excreted oil from their hooves, and that cattle tended to avoid. And so as they gathered around the few watering holes that were around, and the sheep did this, the oil would prevent the cattle from going to that watering hole, and so therefore they couldn't water. And then also a good part of it is that the differences between the way they were managed and the kind of men. Sheep herders were generally older people who were by themselves. A lot of them were Mexican or Basque, whereas the cowboys were often young men on horses doing dangerous work, and the two just did not respect each other. And around this area, it became very high tension. There's a Count Thornrider who I've quoted in some other of my things, said during this time you could not go and greet your fellow sheepmen across the street in Sheridan for fear of being accosted. It was a real thing. So, yes, sir, Mr. Casagra.
In relation to the actual gunfire, or
Mhm.
the gunfight, a friend of mine used to train horses for Robert Trey at Taylor when he had the place out here, and part of his job was to get the horses accustomed to gunfire, because Hollywood didn't want spooky horses dumping their valuable movie star off in the dirt. And so if these guys who were in this thing weren't customarily shooting their six-shooters off around their horses, it's easy to imagine as soon as the first gun went off, the horses were practically uncontrollable. I can imagine where they managed to get off 20 shots and not hit anything with the horses out of control.
Yeah, and that brings up also another point. There were threats, or the Tarbell's faction alleged that George Mitchell made threats against Ray Tarbell. Like I said, he had some bad feelings, and Billy Eubanks apparently went to his house to do something, and George Mitchell said, if Ray Tarbell or John Woodley come on my range, I will kill him. Now then, there were like two witnesses that said they saw them say that at George Mitchell's place. There are also 2-3 witnesses on George Mitchell's side who said that never occurred whatsoever. And so what you got here is that these two things are what I found fascinating was that these two things are so mutually exclusive. You can't believe one and believe the other is presenting an argument in anything close to good faith. You gotta believe that the state prosecuted Ray Tarbell with a bunch of witnesses that were Mitchell's family and Mitchell's employees, and totally ignored probably 10 eyewitnesses that testified in the trial, but not at the preliminary hearing. They testified at the trial 3 months later. You had to believe that. And if you, okay, or you got to believe, if you were on Mitchell's side, and they all do pretty much, that Ray Tarbell came here to kill George Mitchell, and whenever he and did everything he could. So what do I think actually happened? I think George Mitchell was a grumpy old man, and he didn't like sheep, and he ran his mouth. And I think Lake Wilson got tired of it, and he and Ray Tarbell decided they were not going to be pushovers with regard to this, and that at the end, neither one of them was willing to back down from this fight. Each fight had multiple, and I mean multiple, avenues to have avoided this fight if they wanted to. And none of them did anything close to it. Okay? If Ray Tarbell didn't want to provoke George Mitchell, but he didn't want to have George Mitchell at the roundup, he could have let his nephew cut his uncle's cow. He could have done that, but he didn't. And so when Ray Mitchell and Henry Jackson come into the roundup the day before, armed, and they see George Mitchell's cattle being collected, and then they leave, and then Tarbell finds out these two came to the roundup armed, and so that's why they supposedly came armed the next day when the shooting occurred. Okay, but but on the other hand, Tarbell, Woodley, and Jackson are coming into the roundup, and they see Mitchell. They immediately lope to go confront him. And who does Ray Tarbell send to go find out George Mitchell's intentions? He has 5 different people there with him at the time. Who does he send? John Woodley. Who were the 2 people supposedly George Mitchell had threatened to kill? John Woodley and Ray Tarbell. And you send the one guy to find out his intentions. Seems a little bit provocative. But on the other hand, okay, if you want to know what Roy Garber testified to, he testified that on Tarbell's behalf that Jackson had fired first, and all these stories get really flourished. When George Mitchell went and got Henry Jackson's gun, he pulled out his gun and he said, "Ray Tarbell, you're my man." And then gets back, and they go out, and he tells his son, "Let's get out of here." And that's when Tarbell comes up behind and says, "I don't want to shoot you in the back." And then, as Mitchell turns around, with a gun in his left hand, supposedly says, "I don't have a gun or a knife. I want to fight you guys fair." So this becomes to the point of ridiculousness. And so, like I said, so you can't say the state, if you believe the state, there is a well-financed cabal of sheepmen who have had the time and the money to change several people's testimony so that Ray Tarbell can go free. You have to believe that. Okay? Because There is no, there's no, there's no, these are saying, they're all saying the same thing. And if you are the defense here, the state of Montana is railroading an innocent man who simply defended himself too well. So, and this is not, and this was par for, this type of justice system was par for the course in eastern Montana and in northeastern Wyoming, in my opinion. So, to cattle. And that doesn't surprise me, because I said it during the initial formation of this ranch. Mitchell had an agreement with Selwyn, and they had an understanding, and it seemed to work. And then Robert Selway left, and that left Dello Selway and Link Wilson. And I don't know what the nature of it, and that sounds like something that very well might have been involved in the dispute between Mitchell and Link Wilson. But also him transitioning into cattle himself, that wouldn't have harmed him as much as if he was exclusively sheep at that point. And so, but that does sound like something that's very well could have been the specifics of the dispute.
Well, the problem that I heard in addition to that is that was going on way late in the fall of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And the ground was starting to freeze, and there was no way in the world they could get the posts in the ground to do the job, and that really created a hard rub between the two of them.
Yeah.
That's what I heard.
Yeah, and like I said, George Mitchell, for all the people that supported him, and not just his family, but even his friends said George Mitchell was quarrelsome. So.
Well, I think.
Good
then
for book
again,
sales, though.
what?
Good for book sales.
Good for book sales. And so, like I said, it's based one of the most infamous stories that happened. I think a lot of it is that conflict of how often did you actually have two cowboys pointing guns at each other, ready to fire? That actually didn't happen all that much. And so anyway, there are no more questions. I thank all of you for your hospitality. And if you want to read more detail about this or any of the other subjects, I got 35 little signets over there in a book, in this book, actually. It's been selling very well, or you can buy them at bookstores. There's also Kindle versions or ebook versions as well. And we're working on more. I have a website, Red Shell Reflections. That's on the book, and this is 35 stories. There are 7 more on that website, and as I continue to write for the Powder River Examiner and other magazines, we'll continue to add it. It's a free. So, anyway, all right. Thank you very much.